Thank you very much, Mary. I also want to begin with thanks to the organizers, to FAU, to Anat in particular, but also to Mary, Carmen, and Carlos for our email exchanges before we got here. So we did some prior work that was really helpful. So I am going to do this presentation sort of like reflections on my work on Turkey and hopefully to gather together some general points at the end for our discussion. So let me go right away since we are short of time. As a result of the historical overlap between Kemalist nation building in post-Ottoman Turkey and the rise of the modern movement in interwar Europe, Turkey was one of the first peripheral, non-Western, whatever you want to call it, countries to embrace modernism.
Can you hear about that?
Can you hear me?
Maybe speak up a little.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I guess I have to shout more. Okay. So Turkey was one of the first countries to embrace modernism. While it was German and Austrian architects who played the leading roles, young Turkish architects enthusiastically received the new architecture, as modern movement was then called, making it the founding ideology of their professional identity in the 1930s. This is from the first inaugural issue of the professional journals, obviously starting with Le Corbusier as the revolutionary architect par excellence, and obviously I use this painting in my book because of it's such a good representation of the revolutionary self-consciousness of the Republic, self-representation. On the one hand, this seems to, this, like this is again from the same professional journal showing the modern movement, principles of the modern movement. On the one hand, this seems to confirm the Eurocentric premises of the modernist canon, that modernism in peripheral geographies was a simple and in the long run historically inevitable extension, importation, imitation, whatever you want to call it, of Western forms, techniques and discourses without anything original to contribute. Yet upon closer inspection, these other modernisms show us that even when built forms are the same or similar, the particularities of historical context, Carmen was talking about, cultural meaning and political agency call for new approaches to this material. Most importantly, canonic modernism emerged in most peripheral countries, whether it's post-imperial like in Turkey or is it post-colonial like in India, as a utopian symbol of newness introduced from above under the sponsorship of new nation states with progressive nation-building ideologies. And B, this is very important, in the conspicuous absence of the historical, material, and social conditions that gave rise to modernism in Europe, namely industrialization, urbanization, capitalist markets, and autonomous bourgeois, and the presence of private non-state actors on the building scene. These were not there in Turkey. Hence, the most salient feature of such peripheral modernisms was the primacy of the symbolic or representational function of modern forms, in most cases defying the rationalist and functionalist explanations in terms of which these forms were justified. Like I'm showing you here, obviously, three very different functions with very similar forms, even though the architects continuously argued how form was an expression of function and rationalities. Modern architecture was, before everything else, a form of visible politics, a showcase of modernity and progress, rather than the outcome of a real social transformation with a material basis in the country's building industry. It was nonetheless a remarkable period of creative engagement with modernism in Turkey, involving a diversity of actors, Germans and Turks, but also Russians, some French and Italians. Yet unlike Brazil and to a certain extent Eastern Europe, who we already said that were part of the avant-garde at one time or other in their history, Turkey's modern architecture largely remained outside the canonic histories produced in the West in the first half of the 20th century. A few German language publications like Der Baumeister or Moderne Bauformen occasionally featured some work by Egli, Holzmeister or Taut, but in general neither the work of the Germans including prominent Weimar modernists in exile, like Margarita Schulte-Ligotsky, who was in exile in Turkey after her Frankfurt years, nor that of their Turkish colleagues made it to avant-garde circles and European publications in the interwar period. The very interesting work of Russian designers who built a number of textile plants in Anatolia in the 1930s, like Ivan Nikolaev, who was actually connected to constructivist circles in Russia, these were unknown until relatively recently. Why was Turkey's modernism ignored for so long? And why did Turkish modernists remain so isolated? None of them, by the way, were SIAM members or participants in SIAM meetings or anything like that. First, I think we have to consider the role of well-established Orientalist frameworks through which Turkey was viewed as culturally, linguistically, and historically too different and quintessentially non-Western, regardless of the Westernizing aspirations of the new Republican regime. This, by the way, is not the 19th century bad Orientalism, if I may call it, that constructed the Orient as an inferior other. You know, this is the Edward Saidi paradigm, but rather, can we call it the good Orientalism? I mean, a big question mark. Peter, as GST was saying, that Edward Said will turn in his grave if he heard good and Orientalism together. But anyway, good Orientalism, tinted with primitivism of 20th century modernists, who admired the Orient as the source of a timeless wisdom, lost that while European architects who visited or worked in Turkey in the first half of the 20th century, like Le Corbusier, Bruno Taut, and Ernst Egli, they admired, studied, and wrote about European good Orientalism, which is its reflection in the formative nationalist ideology that shaped the first generation of modernist Turkish architects, who, until the post-World War II period, remained profoundly ambivalent about the internationalist discourse of the modern movement, and very skeptical of the avant-garde, even when they followed its aesthetic canons. Turning themselves into the country's first native architectural historians and researchers, they produced the seminal texts and the most elaborate surveys and the most thorough historical studies of Ottoman monumental and vernacular architectures in this period, precisely when overtly historicist forms such as domes and arches were banished from architectural practice. This is very interesting because most of the time it's the same people, like this architect, Sedat Çetintaş, who is designing in modern style, but also on the side producing these books on architecture, these very elaborate, beautiful survey drawings and doing exhibitions, etc. It's almost like this dual identity of these architects. For example, Celal Esat Arseven, prominent art historian, critic and educator of the early Republic of Turkey, gives a textbook example of reading history through modernist lenses to document and demonstrate the compatibility of Turkish national traditions with the principles of the modern movement, to render the past operational for the present, if you use Tafuli's terms. He argues in the introduction, using the example of minaret forms, for example, that unlike the other Islamic architectures, Arab and Persian, Ottoman forms are uniquely proto-modern in their undecorated simplicity, rationality, and functionality, and that we should focus on the superb tectonic and volumetric compositions of Ottoman architecture. Gideon would have called this constituent facts of history, rather than their decorative and ornamental programs, in terms of which European Orientalists of the bad kind have typically studied Islamic and non-European traditions. This is just to give you a glimpse. I mean, this book is a very, very important book, 1928, nationalist text on Turkish art and architecture, but it is written with the subtext of proving its modern potentialities. And sure enough, 2 years later, in this little book, which was adapted from André Louchsa, he concluded, naturally, the modern movement would be perfectly at home in Turkey, given the rationality of her historical traditions. So he introduced Weissenhoff and La Sara, Seal, etc., and then said how this architecture would be at home in Turkey. Sedat Hakkı Erdem, arguably the most prominent modern Turkish architect, forged a more direct link between national traditions, in this case vernacular rather than monumental, and modern practice. He reconstructed, literally and theoretically, the timber frame Ottoman Turkish house as a proto-modern type, this house, waiting to be reinterpreted in reinforced concrete. And then by his own admission, he discovered this Turkish house in Europe after seeing Villa Savoye and realizing the similarities in concept, configuration, and constructional logic. So there's this very interesting link. Le Corbusier seeing it, building Villa Savoye, and Erdem seeing Villa Savoye and bringing it to his own practice. Erdem's grand tour in Europe, 1928-1930, which is the reverse of Le Corbusier's Voyage Utile, some 17 years earlier, offers a telling example, I think, of our conference theme: transferences, flow of ideas, not just from the center to the periphery, but in both directions. That Erdem, by the way, is still the only modern Turkish architect known outside of Turkey, other than the great Sinan, of course, that he has become a Turkish brand in the way that Barragan has become a Mexican brand or Fatih an Egyptian brand, underscores how the periphery has been interesting only insofar as it expresses its cultural, national specificity and difference. Let me now turn to our new book with Esra Akcan that Mary kindly mentioned from Reaction. And notice the plural, you can't read this, but the series is called World Architectures, Modern Architectures of the World, with the plural. While the existing scholarship on modern Turkish architecture, including our own earlier work, you can see here, before my book, there was only one book in Turkish by a professor of mine, and then some German publications like Bernd Nicolai's book, and recently many others are coming. But while all of these are focused on the early Republican period, 1923 to World War II, in this book with Esra, we expanded the temporal scope of Turkish modernism to include post-World War II developments and bring it up to the present. The renewed significance of the post-World War II period, which, as you know, is the topic of much new scholarship, ongoing dissertations, etc., not just in Turkey but globally, seems to be one of the most productive outcomes of expanding our mental map of modern architecture towards other geographies. It is in the post-war period that the modernist canon spread across a rapidly modernizing and, in most cases, decolonizing world of the global south. It is in this period that convergent theories of modernization postulated a linear, universal path of development that all traditional societies would sooner or later follow. These are Turkey in some American publications of the time, showing how it's changing from a traditional to a Western-style society and hailing Turkey as a perfect model of modernization theory, so to speak. Reinforced concrete slab blocks and honeycomb facades, the tropicalized modernism of the ubiquitous Gris Soleil, became the pervasive aesthetic expression of this brand new world, from India to Turkey to Latin America, symbolizing third world aspirations for democracy, development, and modernity. And in Turkey, the undeniable icon of that was the Hilton Hotel, built in 1952-55 by Skidmore, Owings, and Merritt. While European architectural culture was busy with revisionist and critical re-evaluations of modernism, Team 10 in particular, the mood in the periphery was one of optimism rather than anxiety. Here I'm referring to Sarah Goldhagen's anxious modernism. In dramatic contrast to her early Republican isolation, Turkey, now a multi-party democracy with a growing private sector, was admitted to the Western Club in this period. Turkey became a NATO member in 1952, albeit for no other reason than Cold War geopolitics of a bipolar world, that is, her strategic location on the frontier with Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. I mean, this is the Bosphorus, and even in the opening of the Hilton, the whole emphasis was on how Turkey is the outpost against the Soviet threat in that case. Nonetheless, it still boasted the country's foundational self-identification with the West and excluded her from the 1955 Non-Aligned Nations Conference in Bandung, led by India's Prime Minister Nehru, underscoring how, for a brief moment, geopolitics overrode socio-economic realities, historical ties, and cultural identities. Symbolic of these new geopolitical realities and the Americanization of Turkish modernism in the 1950s, the iconic Istanbul Hilton appeared extensively in Western architectural media, for example, with the beautiful photographs of Ezra Stoller in Architectural Forum, but still not without subtle Orientalist touches. We love this photograph of the tulip room, you know, this very Oriental room within a very modern building, or the fact that this canopy, which Sedat Erdem designed in collaboration, which he considered as an example of tin shell concrete, very progressive new structure, was immediately nicknamed the flying carpet, and things like that. So the whole coverage of it is in those Orientalist terms. In the meantime, the earlier isolation and peripherality of Turkish architectural culture seemed to be over. A second generation of modernist Turkish architects, unencumbered by the nationalism of the previous generation, engaged with international developments, and actually later, these are Turkish architectural magazines, and later some of them wrote histories of that period that are unfortunately in Turkish, but some of the best analysis of that time. For example, Şevki Van, the author of this recent book, he's dead now, but he had the first critique of what he calls Hiltonism, so he was analyzing the impact of Hilton on Turkish architecture. At the same time, modernism became mainstream and truly native. It became an anonymous, ordinary, or everyday modernism of reinforced concrete slab blocks, whether they are apartments, hotels, shopping centers, offices, made possible by an expanding domestic building industry. In Turkey and elsewhere in the periphery, from Beirut to Caracas, the encounter with actual processes of modernization, industrialization, rapid urbanization, and especially massive migration from the rural hinterland dramatically transformed the physical fabric of cities. I couldn't help putting these because there was so much similarity when I went to Beirut between Turkey and Lebanon. So, by expanding our temporal frame into the post-war era in the book, we also expanded the thematic boundaries of modern architecture to include these anonymous modernisms, if I may call it, resulting from informal, even illegal practices, namely the speculative apartment boom and squatter houses in Turkey, but also which constitute the unauthored, unregulated, and pervasive modern vernaculars of the third world. So, how far do we extend our time frame then? Is there room for current developments in histories of modern architecture? Well, if questions of housing and urbanism are the central concerns of modern architecture, as they were when its canonic histories were written, then modernism is alive and well in countries like Turkey. Since the 1990s, the rate of urbanization and production of new reinforced concrete blocks of mass housing in Turkey, like these you see, mostly through a speculative partnership between the state and large private developers, have reached such truly phenomenal levels that early Republican modernists could not have even dreamed of in terms of scale and magnitude, really. But there's something else that the early Republican modernists could not have dreamt of. That is the return with a vengeance of Turkey's Ottoman Islamic identity. This is a very new mosque which opened last summer. It's called the Mimar Sinan Mosque, doubly in south, I suppose. In that complex, you can see this tower. So it's right there in the middle of these towers. And I juxtaposed it, of course, with the books of Taut and Egli, you know, who were promoting Lilia Mosque, one of Sinan's masterpieces in Edirne, and this is actually a replica of Sinan. So, after a century of resenting European Orientalism and struggling to prove her credentials as a bona fide member of the Western world, Turkey has now embraced her Oriental Islamic identity, forged closer ties with other Asian and Middle Eastern countries for the first time since World War I, and largely lost interest in its bid for EU membership. At the same time, the country boasts a vibrant economy, wealth generation, expanded technology use, and integration with global markets. It's a textbook case of what scholars call divergent theories of modernity, as opposed to the convergent theories of modernity that dominated the post-war period. In other words, that peripheral countries are indeed becoming modern, but in their own ways and no longer resembling Western trajectories. And here I cannot help showing these three advertisements for hotels from 19th century, the Hilton advertisement in mid-20th century, and a new hotel in Istanbul now. And what I want to emphasize is while these were European representations of the Oriental Istanbul, this is now a Turkish self-orientalization as a marketing tool. So, finally, the speed, magnitude, and destructiveness of modernization has itself been a threat to modernisms everywhere, raising the seemingly paradoxical issue of preserving the modern and necessitating to reconceptualize modern architecture as historical heritage. In Turkey, where a restless and incomplete project of modernity continues to erase its own traces along the way, iconic modern buildings of the early Republican period, some of which were already torn down by 1950, are now being demolished everywhere in the frantic building boom of post-Kemalist Turkey, in spite of the best efforts of a young Lokomomo Turkey. Either they are demolished or in derelict situation like the Russian architect's factory building. Okay, so I'm done with the historic bits. I'm going to very quickly go through that. Or should I just leave that out?
What were you?
The summary. Okay. So where does the historiography of modern architecture stand now? And just a few quick points. As stated in the opening of the 9th Docomomo Conference on Other Modernisms in 2006, the Eurocentric biases, presumed internal consistency and morphological integrity of modernism can no longer be taken for granted. I think we all agree that the modernist canon has been challenged, revised, and contested by other hitherto neglected modern trajectories that include, by the way, not only other geographies of the global south, but also other morphologies, more vernacular, more historicist variations, and other actors and collectivities, like I mentioned, anonymous architects, builders, developers, informal processes, etc. So, second, we now think of modern architecture as plural, decentered, heterogeneous, and worldwide. I underline these words because these are the kind of words used by recent literature, by Tuan Lu's edited book, Panyotis, and others, Parthamitter in art history, etc. It's no longer seen as the sole property of Europe, nor a unidirectional European export to the rest of the world, but is reconceptualized as the collective property of all countries which have engaged with European modernism in a myriad of different ways along uneven histories, asymmetries, and time lag. So we look at translations, this is Esther Akcan's work, or we look at dense local practices of domesticating, selecting, mixing, and reinventing modernism, and we try to give voice and agency to local actors. We try to reconceptualize the term influence, a central art historical traditional concept, not as one party giving its goods to an inferior other, but rather an exchange that involves two-way interaction and choice, etc. So from this decentered perspective, the condition of peripherality, and this is obviously fluid, already it has been touched by Mary and Carmen, and in the case of Turkey, the fact that Turkey is included in the series of modern architectures of the world, but also there are pieces on Turkey in a book on, you can't see anything I don't think, but third world modernism, on Mediterranean modernism, on Middle Eastern modernism. So all these, how geography is fluid, and that's something we have learned. But also, we also will talk, I'm sure, about how it varied in time, like Turkey becoming more accepted to the Western club after World War II because of geopolitics, or Eastern Europe dropping from the canon afterwards of World War II, or places like Africa that are still outside the whole discourse. So all of this fluidity. 4, we are no longer content with the binary structures of the Saidian paradigm, that's center, periphery, east, west, metropole, post-colony, etc., but instead we explore multi-directional relationships, transnational flows and networks, not just between the first and the third worlds, but among different third world countries. So we focus on the stories of travel, exile, immigration, and crisscross cultural exchanges, as well as the role of publications, media, exhibitions, actors, and networks, to use the Latour term. Having uncoupled modernism from, which is an aesthetic discourse, from modernization, which is a much longer historical process, we also need new temporal frameworks and new periodizations beyond the canonic interwar years, but this also raises new questions. For example, one of the questions I'm very interested in are early modern or proto-modern periods, say Ardu and this Ottoman revivalism in Turkey, or you can think of Indo-Saracenic in India, styles like that. Are these a legitimate part of the historiography of modern architecture in the long durée? That's still very debatable. I mean, in my book, when I called this first moderns, my professors were furious. Why would this be a modern? It is modern because it's an urban office building in a very with modern materials, modern programs, etc., etc. So I end with the question: even what is modernism? Is it a period style of the early 20th century, which is now delegated to the status of historical heritage to be preserved? And as you know, here lies the paradox of the Komomo. How you can preserve something, the very definition of which is about newness and transience? Or is it a set of ideals, discourses, and practices that have transformed different parts of the world in different ways, at different times, and continue to do so today? I end with this advertisement from Istanbul, which uses the word modern in some new residential development. So the periphery opens up all these questions for us to discuss. Thank you. Sorry.